I'm 84. I've been washing my hair the same way since 1962. Same motion, different brand every few years. Always something from a bottle on the edge of the tub. My granddaughter Clara was visiting last fall, 14 years old, and she watched me scratch the back of my head at breakfast and said, "Grandpa, you do that every morning." I told her it was dry skin. She said, "You've been saying that my whole life." That stopped me cold, because she was right, and I hadn't noticed how long it had been going on. I've written some of this down. It's in my book, the Coleman Remedy book. Links right there in the description. But what I want to tell you today starts long before the book. It starts in a house in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the years before we had running water, and a woman named Ida, who never once in her life bought something in a bottle to wash her hair. If you're past 60 and your scalp is dry, your hair thinning faster than it should, your skin feeling stripped and tight by the end of each day, stay with me a few minutes. I think you'll recognize something in what I'm about to say. Not because I'm telling you something new, because I'm putting words to something you've already been living. If you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. And when we're done, leave me a comment down below. Tell me if this sounds like your life. I'd like to know if I'm the only one who took 60 years to see what was right in front of him. There's a particular smell I still carry from Sunday evenings in Harlan County. Rosemary heating in water on a cook stove. Something sharp and green and clean underneath it that I couldn't have named when I was a child, but that I now know I was breathing every week without realizing what it meant. My grandmother on my father's side, Ida, Earl's mother, a woman who stood barely 5 feet tall and had opinions about everything, and the patience that comes from having earned the right to every one of them. She would heat a big enameled pot on the cook stove on Sunday evenings, not just for washing, for the rinse. She kept a small jar on the shelf near the basin, something she'd prepared herself earlier in the week. Rosemary she'd dried from the back of the property, steeped overnight in water with a careful pour of apple cider vinegar, sometimes a spoonful of raw honey when she could spare it. She'd work it through her hair slowly, let it sit the way you let a good thing settle, then rinse with the warm water from that pot. Her hair, at 73 years old, was still mostly dark, still thick enough that she wore it pinned up because it was simpler that way. I remember noticing that without knowing what I was noticing, the way children register important things before they have the language for them. I never asked her why she did it that way. You don't ask your grandmother to explain herself. You watch and you carry the image, and you don't know for 40 more years what it was you were seeing. When I left for the University of Kentucky in 1959, one of the first things I did in that dormitory was buy a bottle of Prell shampoo. Green, thick, a smell I couldn't identify, but that seemed to mean something modern and clean and forward-moving. I stood under a real shower. I believe it was the first one I'd ever used in my life, because we'd had a clawfoot tub back home. And I thought, this is what progress feels like. Lather, rinse, done. 30 seconds. That was the trade I made without knowing I was making it. Eleanor and I had a whole shelf of those bottles over the years. Shampoos, conditioners, things that promise thicker hair and shinier hair and hair that would outlast us both. Labels in fine print I couldn't read without my glasses. We bought what was on sale. After a while you stop seeing the shelf altogether. It becomes furniture. You reach without looking, you rinse, you move on with your morning. My father's notebook, the one Earl kept in his careful block handwriting, over 200 pages of remedies and preparations and observations he'd gathered from his own mother's knowledge, had a whole section on hair and scalp care. I'd read through that book many times over the decades, but I always moved past those pages. Seemed too simple, too much like something from before the world got organized. I was an engineer. I'd been trained to trust systems, processes, things that could be verified. I figured if something was worth knowing, it would have been kept. That's the kind of thinking that takes 60 years to correct. It starts as something small. It always does, with the things that matter. About 4 years ago, I began noticing a dryness in my scalp I couldn't account for. A tightness behind my ears and along the back of my neck. That particular sensation of skin that has been stripped of something it was meant to keep. Not painful, just persistent in the way that small, persistent things have of becoming the background noise of your days. I'd scratch sometimes in the morning without deciding to, just absently, the way you scratch without knowing your hand has moved. I mentioned it once to my doctor. He told me to try a different shampoo. I bought one with a different label. The feeling stayed the same. I didn't connect those things the way an engineer should connect them. When something changes slowly over years, you adjust to the new condition so gradually you stop calling it a change. You file it under getting older. You assume the body is doing what bodies do at this point in the proceedings, and you stop asking whether you're contributing to the problem. Eleanor would have made the connection sooner. She had a nurse's eye for the small things, the kind of observation that doesn't need a chart or a test, just a steady quality of attention to what the body is actually saying. She used to say, "Arthur, your body talks in a whisper long before it starts to shout." I heard her say that 40 times across our life together. I didn't always hear what she meant by it. After she passed, I made a lot of small adjustments on my own. I changed what I ate when my digestion told me to. I went back to the warm soaks for my hands when the arthritis came back through the winters. I kept making the herbal tonic every morning, the one my father used to make before me, the recipe that has been in this family longer than I have. But the bathroom shelf, those bottles, I never questioned that shelf. It was such an ordinary thing. The kind of ordinary thing that hides in plain sight, because it has always been exactly where you expect it. I spent a good while putting this down in writing, because I didn't want to get it wrong. It's all in the Coleman Remedy book, the chapter on what happens to aging skin and scalp when you strip the natural oils away consistently. What those oils are actually for, what the body does when they're taken week after week. The measurements for the rinse are in there too, exactly as my father wrote them, with Eleanor's nursing notes alongside. If you want the details, the link is in the description. I put them in the book because I wanted them to be right before my memory started giving me trouble. The thing about most commercial shampoos, not all, but most, is that they're efficient. That's not the problem exactly. The problem is what efficient cleaning does to the sebum layer, which is the natural coating your scalp produces to regulate and protect itself. When you strip it completely with a detergent designed to cut through oil, every single washing, your body responds by trying to replace what was taken. For younger people, that often means oiliness. For older people, whose skin already produces less sebum, it means the opposite: dryness, tightness, irritation that doesn't go away because the cause doesn't go away. I didn't understand this then. I assembled it later, piece by piece, the way you put things together when you finally decide to sit down and look. Clara was here in October, 4 days. She came up from Austin with my daughter Patricia, what Patricia calls the fall visit, which is her way of making sure the house is standing and that her father is eating something green. I don't mind the visits. We sit at the kitchen table in the mornings with oatmeal and the east window light, and we talk properly, the three of us. That's the part of '84 that doesn't get mentioned in the brochures. On the second morning, Clara was watching me the way 14-year-olds watch things when they haven't yet learned to pretend not to notice. I was reading the paper. I scratched the back of my head without deciding to. She said, "Grandpa, you do that every morning." I said it was dry skin. She said, "You said that last time I was here." Now, when a 14-year-old tells you something has been going on for a while, you have two choices. You dismiss it and finish your oatmeal, or you let it sit with you until evening and take it seriously. I've been around long enough to know that the people who see us most clearly are usually the ones we've assumed weren't paying attention. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, I went to the study and took my father's notebook down from the top shelf. It still has that smell, aged paper and something faintly mineral I've never been able to name precisely. Maybe the old binding, maybe something from the land that got into it during all those years in Earl's house. I turned to the section I had always moved past, the one he titled in his careful letters, "Hair and Scalp Treatments, What Works and What Doesn't." Page 71. He'd copied his mother's rosemary rinse there exactly. The measurements, the preparation time, how long to let it sit before rinsing, practical and plain, the way he wrote everything. And in the margin, in a slightly different ink, the kind of thing a man adds when he comes back to a page years later, in his handwriting. The bottles at the store take away what God put there. This puts it back. My father was not a poetic man. When he wrote something, he meant it plainly. I sat in that chair for a long while, with the book in my hands and the house quiet around me. The next morning, I realized I'd run out of my usual shampoo. I hadn't thought to check before the visit. I went out to the garden before full light. Cold in October, the way North Carolina gets cold. That clean, sharp cold that fills your lungs and settles the mind. And I cut a handful of rosemary from the south fence. I had apple cider vinegar in the kitchen. I heated water on the stove, the way the notebook described. I stood in that bathroom and did what Ida had done in that kitchen in Kentucky 60-some years ago, when I was a boy watching without knowing I was learning. It felt unremarkable. That's the only honest way I know to say it. No moment of revelation, no particular feeling of things falling into place. Just the smell of rosemary in warm water and the same calloused hands I've always had, working it through. I went about my morning, but 3 weeks later, the tightness behind my ears was quieter. The morning scratching, I noticed I'd stopped doing it. My scalp felt different in a way I don't have a single precise word for. Settled is the closest I can come. Like something had been returned to it that belonged there. I went back to the notebook and read the full section. Then I pulled Eleanor's nursing journal from the same shelf, found her pages on sebum production and skin barrier function, the science underneath what my father had written in plain English, without knowing the scientific names for what he was describing. The two notebooks agreed with each other, the way they almost always did when I thought to hold them side by side. A coal miner from Kentucky and a registered nurse from Knoxville, working from entirely different traditions, arriving at the same place. I still make the rinse every Thursday evening. I heat the water on the stove the way the notebook says. I cut the rosemary from the south fence. It's there in the garden right now, woody and patient in March. Not impressive looking yet, but it'll be a different thing entirely by May. I add the vinegar and sometimes the honey. It takes about 10 minutes from start to finish. It costs me nearly nothing. My scalp is not 25 years old. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But it is quiet in a way it wasn't a year ago. That persistent low-level irritation I'd been living with, the kind I'd filed away under the category of just getting older, it's mostly gone. What replaced it is simply nothing, which is what the skin is supposed to feel like when it's being treated the way it was designed to function. That's the hardest part about learning something late, not the learning itself, the arithmetic of all the years before it. Eleanor would have figured this out sooner. She found most things before I did. But she isn't here, and I am. And so I'm the one sitting at this kitchen table, trying to say it plainly to people who might recognize what I'm describing from their own bathrooms, their own mornings, their own years of reaching for the same shelf without ever stopping to ask what exactly they were reaching for. I've written it all down, the rosemary rinse with proper measurements, the variations for drier scalps and for different hair types, the cross-references from Eleanor's journal, the chapter on what aging skin actually needs and what most modern products are built to do instead. Everything I assembled from my father's notebook and Eleanor's notes, and my own years of paying attention. I called it the Coleman Remedy Book. The link is in the description below. I'm not a doctor. I've been clear about that from the beginning, and I'll be clear about it now. This is not medical advice, and I've never called it that. It's the record of one man and the woman he married, and the father who taught him that writing things down was the only reliable way to make sure they didn't disappear. Read it the way you'd read a letter, not looking for a prescription, looking for company. That's what I wrote it for. My daddy put a sentence on the first page of his notebook, sometime in the 1940s, before I was old enough to read. What grows near you can heal you. He meant it as a practical note about the garden, about the plants his mother had taught him to use. But I've sat with it a long time now, and I think there's more in it than gardening. The rosemary on my south fence has been there for 11 years. It grew in the same soil I walk through every morning before the sun comes up. It cost me nothing. Nobody packaged it and put a label on it. At 84, I don't have time for things that don't work. What grows near you can heal you. I don't have a tidier conclusion than that. Some things you carry your whole life before you understand what you're carrying.